Hello everyone, David Zuckerman here at Maple Tree Place in Williston. Sort of typical shopping place that some people go to, and we think sort of everyday life is alright. It's a sunny day, life is good. But the reality is, for many in our state and across the country, as we've seen in the last week or so, unfortunate instances where it's come to light that not everything is good and not everything is okay for people of color in particular, and also unfortunately for retribution for actions that now law enforcement has also suffered tremendous loss in our country. And we're here today to start or continue a conversation, but to really start a new page in Vermont where we tackle the issues of racial bias and discrimination and inherent biases in ourselves, both as individuals and as a state, with some of the policies that we have, or maybe address it with some of the policies that we need. I'm joined today by a number of different folks in the community who have personal experiences, legislative experience, and other bits that they're going to be adding with respect to feelings, emotions, and actions that we all need to consider taking to make our state a better place for all people. And I'm here today as a candidate for lieutenant governor, but also as a state senator who, for 18 years in the legislature, has worked to bring people together from different perspectives, to bring ideas to the table, and to work to organize around the state in order to make progress and make change where we need to make it. And earlier this legislative process, or this political process, I had a press conference about a rural economic task force that I was putting together, or will put together, as lieutenant governor, to really bring together different minds. I have Clark Hinsdale's support from the Farm Bureau and Enid Wannicott's support from NOFA Vermont, and so that agricultural perspectives from different venues to come together to talk about how we'll build our rural economy. And what we're here today to talk about, and bringing people together from different perspectives, is how also as lieutenant governor we will make sure this conversation doesn't fade into the background, as it unfortunately has often done after such tragedies, but that we keep it in the forefront of our discussion so that we can really change the discourse and discussion and the dynamic here in Vermont for people of color. We sadly do have results from studies that show that people of color are disproportionately pulled over in their vehicles, are disproportionately incarcerated in Vermont. At 1 in every 14 people of color, males, are in prison, one of the highest rates in the country. And I think we all know that folks who perpetrate crimes on other people are not disproportionately of one race or another. And so unfortunately we do have some inherent biases in either our policing or our enforcement or our prosecution of people of color. And my goal would be that we work to address that, whether it be through community action or political changes in policy. And one of the things that we saw in the study is that even barracks by barracks throughout the state, there are different rates of disproportionate traffic stops. And so we need to look at that in our state law enforcement and figure out why that's happening and work to improve it. This is not about pointing fingers. It's not about saying it's all one person or another person or one group of people's fault. But what can we as a community do to come together to help us all become better citizens and work to look at our own inherent biases to work towards a better community. I feel very fortunate today to be joined by a number of folks that I've invited, and actually some of them invited others on my behalf. And that's really what it's about, is networking out through the community to bring folks together to speak today about different perspectives that you have. And that's so important, because as elected officials, as people in power, we can claim to know all the answers, we can claim to put out solutions, but really it's folks in the community that live these experiences every day that are going to give us the best ideas about what we can do to improve Vermont with all people and all communities. So I'm going to first introduce Jamel Rogers, and then I'll continue on with each of the next ones. Jamel,
All right.
thank you.
My name is Jamel Rogers. I'm a singer-songwriter, and I just want to touch base on a few things that Senator Zuckerman had said about not pointing the finger or not placing blame, but looking at it objectively. And for me, it stems back to accountability. Accountability for everything, not just law enforcement, employers, us as African Americans, just looking at why, either we're targeted or what kind of things provoke different reactions from different types of people. It goes back to taking responsibility. And I know in this country it's been weird. For years we've worked to have equality or sense of equality, and it gets tainted when it's going, it's not going both ways. So I would encourage people that are watching this, or people that want to be active in their community, to take accountability. Take accountability for how others may perceive you, or how your community perceives what you're doing or what we're doing, and we just have to really focus on not the problem, but a solution. And the solution comes from being aware of your surroundings and having compassion for your neighbor. I think it stems back to taking responsibility for a lot of mishaps happening, and people taking responsibility for how they were acting. If we have nurturing hearts and we have compassion to just want to be humans, then it shouldn't be disproportionate results. It should be across the board. It should be at least more equal and even. And it's not all up to law enforcement in my eyes. It's not all up to any one person. It's all of us collectively coming together to acknowledge that there is an issue, and it's not going to be addressed by ignoring it. It's going to be addressed by making everybody aware, making everybody a part of it. I have multiple friends of multiple different races, and I think accountability plays a part on both sides. I know there's a lot of guilt or a lot of pressure on both sides of being white. It's like, we might not have had anything to do with this, or this is not how we feel or how we perceive, but this is still happening. And I think that's a form of being accountable. Even saying like, we don't know, we're not a part of this, we don't understand how to react to this. Or saying like, these are the certain things that, allow us to do certain things in these communities. I don't think it's ever really going to change until we first acknowledge it. And I just want to focus on what we can do to bring awareness to the people who are struggling and change that. I think that there's a huge opportunity here in Vermont to do that, being smaller communities, integrated. We have people like Senator Zuckerman who was willing to talk about it, who's willing to give people like me a voice to express my concerns. And my concern now, more than ever, is just making people aware that it is a problem. There are people and families that are separated and incarcerated due to injustice. And it affects all of us. It affects workplaces, people not being able to find jobs or support themselves because of the way that they look or the way that they dress and the way that they talk. And we're accountable for that too. We're accountable for the way that we are perceived, the way that we hold ourselves in our community. And it's critical now more than ever that we come together and that we do something about this. And that's honestly where I stand with this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Next is Representative Gonzalez from Winooski, and I'm really pleased that she could join us today.
I'm excited to be here as a representative of the most ethnically diverse city in the state of Vermont, and it's a fantastic place to live for so many reasons, and part of that is the ethnic makeup and diversity that we have. When we have a lot of diversity, we need to acknowledge it, we need to talk about how valuable and important it is. And when it comes to police and quality policing, it's really important that police look at the history of oppression, the current state of affairs, and really put into place some practices that can reduce unconscious and implicit bias and look at the system of policing. The Black Lives Matter movement has done an amazing job really highlighting and bringing to light the violence that is systematically done against African Americans and people of color in general. And it's not about saying that other lives don't matter. It's saying that this is something that we really need to look at. And the violence that we saw last week, it was definitely really highlighting the way that we need to hold people accountable. So Jamal was talking about accountability, and when we look at the systems of policing, there are some research-based policies that cities and states can put into place to make policing more equitable. I feel very fortunate that the police chief of Winooski has implemented some practices that as a system in policing can really increase some community action and some community communication, that we know that trust between police and community is being eroded as we see more and more, as we see the things that have been happening. And we know that over decades, police nationally have been decreased in accountability. And in Vermont, we have had some really nice movement in terms of fair and equitable policing, that we have some laws that we can support, and that it's so important that we continue doing those. I would really like to see our police chiefs across the state, and for me, and specifically in Winooski and Burlington, since I represent both of those areas, really saying what they have done. That both of those police departments have done some things that are research-based, policy-based, to reduce violence and to make a more community-based policing. And it would be fantastic if they could state that, could really say, this is what we've done, and this is what we plan to do to continue. If other cities and municipalities across the state could also do that, I think it can really increase accountability, increase the health of policing in Vermont, and decrease these disproportionate rates that people of color and African Americans overall are subject to. Because it's not the values of Vermont, and people do not think that these disproportionate things are happening because, and even some people of color think that these things are not happening because they're not seeing it immediately in their life, and because it's not Vermont values. Really, Vermont values are equity, and we need to use our research in order to put systems in place in order to uphold our values of equity. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm pretty good on the basketball court too, but that's not why we're here today. I just want to mention, as when we wrap up after the rest of the speakers, I'm going to be announcing an event that we're going to have, and some of the speakers may reference that for the media's sake. So we're curious if people reference Raise Your Voice. But next is Craig Mitchell, who's going to speak for a moment.
Hi, my name is Craig Mitchell, a local DJ and part of the community for over 26 some odd years, graduate of St. Michael's College. We're very lucky to be in the state that we're in. As you mentioned, there are some disparities, some things where people are pulled over more so than others. People are incarcerated more so than others, but we're sheltered from the violence. We're sheltered from the death and the blood that's running down the streets of America, whether it be at the hands of police or the hands of citizens taking matters into their own hands. And in order to keep that from happening here, we need to all be accountable. We all need to all be a part of the story and be willing to talk to each other and have those hard conversations. It's not easy to call someone out on their ignorance. It's not easy to call out grandpa because, well, that's just grandpa, or that's just Uncle Dave. But we have to do that because that seed germinates. Our young people that they're babysitting hear that. They're taking that information to school. And all it takes is one time for one child to say one thing to someone, to hurt that child's feelings, to take that hatred with them and bring it home. This was a couple of years ago when things were happening in Missouri, and a young man was killed there. I went to Michael Shirley, who was the chief of police in Burlington at the time, and I said, what can be done to help us to make sure that we don't get the same thing happening here? And we started the community barbecue, where the police officers want to put names to faces, and they get back there and they're making burgers for the citizens. And that has continued on with the new police chief, Brandon Del Pozo, who took it one step further. He took it from doing it in Battery Park and moved it into the streets over on North Street. And the people were so happy that people actually that cared about them. They came and they helped put names to faces. And they were no longer a suspect, they were a community member, and they were talking to someone who works for them and with them. And if that happened more, whether it's with our teachers, with our police force, and with each other, communication is key.
Thank you, that's really solid. Thank you, Craig. Aaron Stilson-Wolf is going to speak next.
You guys are a lot more brave than I am. I needed notes. The events of the past few weeks are infuriating, tragic, and heartbreaking. But if these stories are surprising to you, that's your white privilege showing. The evisceration of civil rights for people of color in this country goes back hundreds of years despite advances in legislation. We need to make great change in order to create equity. We need to admit racism exists. It is undeniable to a reasonable person, much like gravity or climate change. But there will always be naysayers because as long as they deny reality, they won't have to accept responsibility. We need accountability and checks and balances for government in order for there to be a real chance for justice. We need to retrain and restructure law enforcement as it stands. Having a government agency as the sole source of accountability to another is flawed in its makeup and lacking perspective. People of color need to have a much greater presence in government in order to better understand the needs and concerns affecting them and how to best address them. And to those people who say to me, we do have diversity in our government. We elected Obama twice. I ask you, does Mitch McConnell speak for all white people? Does Trump? Does Hillary Clinton? No. The idea is preposterous. So if you can recognize diversity amongst white people, you must be able to understand that there is diversity in the people of color community as well. We need to make mental health treatment and counseling free of charge and accessible for people of color to process and begin to heal from the years of trauma they've experienced in our society. Countless people of color suffer from a form of PTSD that is also called PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome. That is a result of PTSD that has been compounded over hundreds of years of slavery and oppression. We need to recognize and address the racial disparities in our prison system. 1 in 14 black males are imprisoned in Vermont. That can never be acceptable. We need to end broken windows policing. Racial disparities drive mass incarceration. Mass incarceration drives racial disparities. It's a vicious cycle that will not end if we do not make drastic changes in policies and practices that drive the disparity. The role of implicit bias and stereotypes in decision making, and the structural disadvantage in communities of color, which are associated with arrest. In the 60s, there was great progress, but as a nation, we became complacent, thinking the job was done. But it wasn't, it isn't, and it will not be in the foreseeable future. We cannot wait for history to be made. We have to make history, and to challenge the hypocrisy of our democracy, as Malcolm X put it. We need a coalition of community members from many different backgrounds to join with officials in a safe and welcoming space to work on these and many more issues which permeate every aspect of life, including foster care, child care, education, secondary education, healthcare, job opportunities, transportation, affordable and safe housing, and mental health. The plan Zuckerman has put forth is a great step in perpetuating an ongoing narrative between officials and community. As he is well aware, there are miles to go before we sleep. It will be a tireless struggle to find solutions to issues that have no easy answers. It will be uncomfortable, controversial, complex, and likely inefficient at times. But without risk, serious dedication, and personal sacrifice, we will never have a state or a country with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Erin. That was really hard. Sorry, thank you. Joe, there you are. Thank you. Thank you. My name is Joseph Fiacco. I'm here today to represent everyone up here, myself as a healer, as a business person in the area. Much like Craig, I came to Vermont in the late 90s, graduated from the University of Vermont, and had come from a place that there's even less diversity in the community. I'm here also to represent David Zuckerman. I'm a longtime supporter of him. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the reasons I support you were opposing the Iraq War, gay rights,
Supporting gay rights.
supporting gay rights, GMO labeling laws. I could go on, but those are some of the main reasons that I support this gentleman for many years. I know where to find him. I can go down to the farmer's market, I think still to this day, and talk to him. I probably talk to him a little bit too much on the hot summer days, but I can access my elected representation. I have so much I want to say, but it's already been reflected. Primarily, I was asked to come
And immediately I knew what I was going to say, because on MLK Day of this year, we had already heard these statistics. They were clearly put out to the community. I wasn't surprised of the results of data that we have been collecting, I believe, for over 5 years. I was surprised that it was being talked about. So my question is, why does it take 6 months after a major discovery to the community? I'm honored to be here. What can we do? What can we do as white people? And I asked the question, we met the other day, what can I do as a person? From my own experience, I can listen, I can hold space, I can support. And there's many other things. I'm going to keep asking what I can do. I think simply posing the question to the community is extremely powerful. What I see is not only violence, but it's aggression. It's how we speak to each other. It's how we look at each other. The accountability was mentioned already by Jamal, but I want to reinforce this idea that it's not just a Vermont situation that we're dealing with. I fully opposed the Iraq War and realized from being a social activist in the late 90s into 2000s that this issue of race is not just a Vermont problem, clearly. We are overseas fighting wars primarily against people of color. What I see is violence and aggression. How it makes me feel is disturbed, upset, angry. And what I request is that we do our part, each citizen do their part. Reach out to the Zuckerman campaign if you need my contact information, or to connect with the people on this panel. We have an event called Raise Your Voice coming up in August. The date, as far as I know, has not been set. We would love your participation, your vulnerability to come and ask questions and hold space. Should have put the clock on. I could just keep going, but I'm going to call it. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate the reflections of everyone here and our state representatives. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Much like Aaron, I also needed some notes, so I brought a little bit. And you might understand why once I start speaking. My name is Edmund Owusu. I'm an artist and also a community member as well. I came to UVM on debate scholarship through a friendship with a professor named Alfred Snyder. He is one of many who have given me the tools to properly assess, deconstruct, and critically frame my environment and the circumstances that I usually find myself in. I've been through the criminal justice system. I'm a father whose children have ties to the community. I'm an artist who spends time in the community promoting myself as a way to make a living. So I know many of the people who will see this well. I want to share a short story with you guys, and then we'll talk a bit. My sophomore year at UVM, there was a robbery that occurred of a white student. He called the police and told them that he'd been robbed of his marijuana. The very next morning, there was a female black student, freshman, who was going to class in the dead of winter wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt. Had the police officer stop her. I think back at this time, UVM police were not even technically a police force yet, right? Had UVM police stop her at gunpoint, put a gun to her, make her get down, had another officer show up, and they frisked her before they found out that she wasn't even a male. This story helps me to highlight a couple of the things I want to talk about. The first is white privilege in this situation. The second will be a culture of indifference about the welfare of the black body, and the third will be lack of opportunity for people to show more of their character than what is usually expected of them. So, some Vermonters are upset about the influx of African refugees and the mix of African American transplants, which give them the impression that their town, state, and country are under siege. It's okay to be heightened and uncomfortable. It is not okay to let those concerns govern the way you act and speak when you are amongst other people. There's a collective anxiety hanging over the nation, and it knows no color. White Americans who aren't on the fringes feel caught in the middle of something that they don't understand and let down by their fellow citizens that they see rioting. Black Americans are furious about the lack of accountability, law enforcement, the lack of accountability for the death of the people, of our people, at the hands of law enforcement, and the level to which it appears that it is state-sponsored. If you seem indifferent, intolerant, or unyielding to our concerns, we see you as part of the problem. Vermont is not exempt from the militarization of police that we see all across the country. It has ramped up its surveillance of black and brown bodies, and the reports bear this out. On a primitive level, we are all victims of our own prejudices because we are tied to our very being and often intertwined with life's events that make it hard to untangle, parse, and even evaluate. But that is the work that must be done in light of where our country is, where our state is, and where our communities are headed. I would also like to talk about transparency. Transparency in police procedure and fairness in police practice. For example, 10 years ago, there was a huge portion of the African community who used to come downtown all the time. And they enjoyed many of the same things that college students and many people of other races enjoy. Now that is not the case, and in my eyes, here's why. The criminality of those bodies by tickets of disorderly conducts and things that were ticky-tacky that their white counterparts who were out enjoying their evenings were not receiving made it such that, you know what, once you get 5 disorderly conducts, if you're only making $200 a week, you're probably not going to want to pay the next one. You're probably not coming downtown. And so through other practices, things happened or the police force got what it wanted, where now my friends don't come downtown. So I, as a community organizer, have to do things like have an African barbecue and tell our people to come to Oakledge so that we can enjoy each other's presence simply for just that, the enjoyment of each other's presence. So I think that if we get some transparency in police practices, that will help the community to feel better about what's happening and how those things are happening. And also if we get some oversight, as Aaron mentioned, because when you have one body of the same government overseeing the other, it obviously leaves some room for checks and some imbalances in those checks. And so I think that that kind of oversight would go a long way, as well as some fairness in practice. I want to not be, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the way that I think that police also treat black women. I see many white women treated like damsels in distress, while I see many black women treated as if they are the agitator in many situations downtown. And that is also a part of fairness in practice. We simply want you to treat us the same way you treat everyone else. If you give leniency, when you speak to a white woman who is been thrown out of a bar, give the same leniency to a black woman. Don't grab her up so quick. And those are the kind of things that we want in practice that happen if we have training on a more regular basis, right? Companies have training every 3-5 years because that thing needs to be ongoing so that your mental state and where your skill set is where they need it to be constantly, right? So that you are prepared for the job. And if you're not or you're incompetent, you're fired and you're out of there. There's no reason that when we pay these people to have the jobs that they do and that we want to have a relationship that is beneficial for all so that we know who they are when they are here for our safety, that we shouldn't be able to make that relationship work in a better way. When we say that Black Lives Matter, we're not saying all lives don't matter. If everyone at the table is eating and Edwin doesn't have anything to eat and I say I'm hungry, telling me that everyone is hungry doesn't solve the problem that you're all eating but Edwin is still hungry. That is the metaphor that I can give you for Black Lives Matter. We know everyone's lives matter, but right now there are some people whose lives are being taken on a daily basis. I cried the other day when I thought about coming to speak here because I know it's Vermont and I feel pretty safe. But I also watched on TV a man be shot while being held down by police for doing what I do and have done many times to make a living for my children. I've stood in front of establishments who either condoned or didn't condone what I was doing because I needed to have somebody see that I had talent to give me $5 for a CD. And to see that man be shot while being held down for making a living for doing that, it shocked me and it rocked my soul. And if as a people and as a country we can't do better, then we can do better. And I believe that that's why we're here. I didn't know David Zuckerman from a hole in the wall. Everybody that I've asked of him has spoken highly of the man. I had a final conversation with someone who is one of the few reasons or main reasons that I'm in Vermont, one of my other debate coaches, and he told me he'd worked with David 8 to 10 years ago. And people who do good work often don't remember those kinds of people because you're doing the work and you're moving on to other things. And so David doesn't even remember meeting him. But that's what happens is those stories start to pile up and aggregate. And so I couldn't do anything else but show up and try to represent what I felt like the people I knew wanted to be said. We just want fairness in practice and we want some transparency in the policies so that we know what's going on. If you tell us what's going on and then you do it, then there's no concerns and there's nothing to be done because we know and we see it on paper. But if there's secrecy, then there can be nothing else but guessing game and us us to be left to wonder why these things happen. And so that's all we want. And I think that with somebody like David, who obviously has a strong history of legislating and going after things that he believes, whether he had the machine behind him or not, I think that there's definitely a future for us, especially with Vermonters who we know are different from the rest of the country because they typically want positivity and typically want change. I think that we can definitely head in the right place. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin.
And the last speaker before I close it up is Senator Philip Baruth, and sorry to put you out there, but Senator Baruth is going to speak a little bit as well, please.
Yeah, tough act to follow. Thank you. So, as David said, I'm Phil Baruth. I'm currently the Senate Majority Leader in the Senate. My kids go to school at Flynn and BHS. And those are, like the schools Diana was talking about, those are incredibly diverse places. So when my daughter goes and has a chorus concert, there are 40 flags ringing the gym, and often the songs that are sung are from Africa, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, as well as the United States. And I can leave those places feeling like Vermont has its finger on the way to a better world. And yet, the next morning I'll drive to the State House and hear testimony from people like Jay Diaz from Vermont Legal Aid. He spent a lot of time in Senate Education. He and Legal Aid had come out with a report called Kicked Out. And it was about disproportionate rates of discipline and expulsion for students of color. And his figures were that those students of color were about twice as likely to be kicked out of school, and most districts, not Burlington, but most districts, when you're expelled from school, do not educate you while you're expelled. So if you think about that for a second, it's a vicious circle where someone is unfairly pushed out of school, not educated. When they come back, they're behind, and so on and so on and so on. So the reason I bring that up is because that's something we need to attack in January, but also to give you a perspective on David. He and I both sit on that committee. He asked extremely probing questions about the data, wanted to make sure that the data was accurate and valid, and when he found out it was, he wanted to know how to move forward with it. It didn't ultimately go through, but not for his lack of trying. The other thing that I'll say is that the Lieutenant Governor's office has sometimes been described as a weak office, not much expected of you. I think truly successful lieutenant governors pick very, very difficult issues, and then they work on them over years. They build trust. They bring people from outside the State House into the State House behind a specific legislative fix. And I've seen David do that on marriage equality, GMO labeling, other things that were impossible originally. So when I think about that disproportionate expulsion rate, when I think about disproportionate stops by police, I truly believe that when David says he will impanel a group to not only look into that, but to propose solutions, that could lead to a better Vermont for all of us. So thank you. I know it's hot, and I'll be brief.
Thank you.
So in closing, I do want to also mention Representative Gene O'Sullivan came out today to stand with us all in support of this press conference, but also that I implied we're leading to something. It was mentioned by a couple of the folks who spoke. I'm putting together an event in Burlington, hopefully at Arts Riot, called Raise Your Voice. It's going to be in August, well after the primary. I'm going to have that event, whether I'm continuing to be a candidate for lieutenant governor or not. As a serving senator and as just a member of the community, this is one of the places I want to put my energy towards our future, like I said, regardless of political office. And the event and the goal of the event is both to enjoy ourselves. We can often make more change when we're happy and enjoying ourselves and building on each other's energy, but also to invite policymakers, people in power, law enforcement, police chiefs, particularly in this area, to come down and have an opportunity to sit and listen. Because along with music and entertainment and fun, we're also inviting people in the community to come express experiences, ideas, and what we can do to make the future better. And sometimes as people in power, we all too often think we have the solutions before we've really listened to the deep inherent challenges that are faced out there. And so my goal with this event is to make a safe space for people to speak out about their experiences, for those of us, and I appreciate the elected officials here and others who expressed they wanted to be here but couldn't, Jane Odell, Selena Coburn, and there are many others that we'll be reaching out to, who will be there not to speak to the crowd, but to be a part of the crowd and to listen, and then hopefully be a part of the crowd moving forward with positive efforts for a safer and more inclusive future for our community. So I thank you all for coming to hear this. I thank so many of you all for coming out on short notice to help express what's going on in our community, and certainly questions for anybody here, if you've got them, are welcome.
Yeah, so I guess, so this past legislative session, yourself and other lawmakers passed the bias-free policing law. I guess as Lieutenant Governor, what other sort of actions do you want to see at the state level, at the legislative level, to address these issues?
Well, certainly that's a step in the right direction, and I think what we need to do, looking at this future session, is really listen to the community. Just like I said, we're going to have this event in August, and really understand what's driving this, or what experience people are having, besides the hardcore statistical analysis when it's collected, which is also an issue. The data is not always there. Look at the data that is there. We know that some law enforcement barracks have higher rates of pulling people over based on race than others. Let's figure out why. Sometimes it's the conversation and the discussion and looking at policies that can change without law. It doesn't all have to be laws all the time. As was mentioned, like Joe mentioned, others, introspective, looking at ourselves, paying attention to what we each do as individuals. Those are changes that need to happen as well. And sometimes that happens through discussion and leadership as well. But then look at what policies need to be changed. You know, people in the community know when there's discrepancies happening. And I'm looking to the people in the community to give me those ideas on how we can all talk together. And I look forward to having meetings with law enforcement and members of the community all in the same room, not in a public hearing, he said, she said situation, but in a genuine, let's sit down, eat some food together, and have a discussion about what's going on, and have one in a welcoming space. Because the first challenge is, if it's all accusation and finger pointing, everybody's hackles get up, everybody draws barriers and boundaries, and you don't really build bridges the way that we need to. And I think we all recognize that, you know, the intent of people when they go into law enforcement is to protect and serve and to make the community a safe space. And I think that's true so far abroad in our state as far as intention. But unfortunately we're seeing that some statistics don't bear out that it's quite as equal as it needs to be, and we need to have that conversation in a safe way.
So was the genesis of this the events of last week, or the state police traffic study you began releasing?
Well, I would say all of the above. I mean, for one thing, I would say the conversation that I had with Jamel was on Thursday, and I just want to put that out for point of fact that it was before Thursday night, Friday. But I think we all recognize that no law enforcement should be gunned down in their job, and I presume I speak for all. And so it was partly instigated by really the two other unjust deaths that were
What
caused.
did you think of the EVM study, the traffic data?
Well, I think it certainly is revealing, and it means we have work to do. It confirms what members of the community have been speaking about. You know, Mark Hughes, so many others have been raising their voice, and there has been movement and discussion, but there needs to be far more done. And so this was an effort to continue to join in that effort that others have been leading, frankly. You know, I was not the leader on this. I have an opportunity to help bring people together. And that's one of the roles I can play by being an elected person. And sometimes you get a bigger podium and a bigger event where people come and the media comes. But it is completely a team effort. And I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, 7 terrible deaths occurred last week. But these kinds of deaths are happening every day. And what we're learning with, you know, these smart little devices is now they're getting out into the public more. But as was stated earlier, injustice has been going on for a long time, and for a couple centuries, if not longer, frankly, and they still happen. And we've made progress, but that doesn't mean we're done. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.